Welcome to the inaugural episode of Fixing the Grammys. The Grammys have been making a hash of it for more than 50 years. Tonight, we start to set the record straight and give artists the credit that has long been overdue by correctly telling you who was the best music from each year. Tonight, we begin the journey. Tonight, we fix the year 1967. So who gets the Grammys? Find out next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to the inaugural episode of Fixing the Grammys. Now, before we get started, I know what many of you might be thinking. Metal Dude, what are we doing back in the year 1967? There was no heavy metal in the 60s. To which I would agree. Heavy metal doesn't really become a thing until 1970. However, in the late 60s, there was some exciting developments happening in music around hard rock and proto-metal. Proto-metal being the bands and the musical trends that set the tone for what was to come. Without proto-metal, maybe we never got heavy metal. So it is deserving of some long overdue love. The premise of this show is very simple. We're going to take, currently the Grammys have a heavy metal, kind of a generic heavy metal performance bucket. And they give you 5 nominees to that. A few years back, they had a heavy metal / hard rock performance, 5 nominees. And at times they've had hard rock and heavy metal in separate categories. So we are going to start with that general premise with a kind of hard rock / heavy metal performance. Obviously, in these first few years, it's only going to be hard rock, but you get the general gist. We're also going to take a look at how these bands, while they do get their one award in the narrow category of hard rock and heavy metal, we're also going to see how they fare against the big winners of the year. Again, it's 1967. It's a long time ago, but the Grammys have been messing this up. They've been ignoring hard rock. They've been ignoring heavy metal. And we have a lot of injustices to correct. So we're going to start right here. I hope you enjoy. If you have not subscribed to my channel, please do so. I think we'll be doing a new year each and every year, and you want to be alerted to when those new episodes are available. But without further ado, let's get to the 1967 nominees for Best Hard Rock Heavy Metal Performance. All right, our first nominee, and we do these in alphabetical order, is Cream with Sunshine of Your Love. Now, of course, Cream is a super group that was formed back in the 60s. Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and of course the legendary Eric Clapton make up this fantastic power trio. Now, I'll be honest with you. I'm not a huge fan of Eric Clapton. I'm not a great fan of old slow hand. To me, sometimes Eric Clapton plays a little too slow. I'm not a guitar player by trade. Maybe there's some techniques that he uses. I've never understood his credentials as being the greatest guitarist of all time. I've never really found his playing to be all that intriguing, all that riveting. But if there was one era of Eric Clapton that I do appreciate, it is this era, the Cream era, where his music seems to be a little heavier, and you know, one of my favorite riffs of all time is the riff for this song, Sunshine of Your Love. It really shows a heavier side to Eric Clapton, and this is a sensational song. And again, I want to stress, especially in the 60s, this isn't heavy metal, but it's starting to be that proto-metal. We're starting to see the rise of the guitar god here with Eric Clapton, and the riff that is produced in this song. This album, the album that this comes off of, Disraeli Gears, very underrated album. Again, some of Eric Clapton's best work. So I don't see how in 1967 you can get away from nominating this particular song. And it is our first nominee tonight. Sunshine of Your Love, Cream. All right, our second nominee are The Doors and the song People Are Strange. Now, The Doors had 2 albums in 1967. This was their debut year. And while their first album technically might be my favorite of the 2 albums, off their second album, Strange Days, comes one of my favorite Doors songs of all time, People Are Strange. Now you may say, why are the Doors on this list? Well, again, I believe the Doors start to usher in a new era in music, much darker themes. Jim Morrison starts to really become that front and center frontman. What we've seen in the 60s up to this point is you had solo singers and you had groups. This is really one of the first bands that I can see where you have a band put together, but the frontman just starts to take stage. It's the model for what a lot of our heavy metal and hard rock bands would adopt in the 70s. And again, I really think that up until this point, you had a lot of different types of music. But The Doors is really the beginning of that kind of darker themed music that many hard rock and heavy metal bands would adopt. So, our second nominee, The Doors and People Are Strange. All right, speaking of moody and creepy, our third nominee, Jefferson Airplane, and their legendary song, White Rabbit. Again, very similar to The Doors. This is a very dark, this is about the drug culture of the 60s, presented in a very creepy, moody way. I love this song. This is the first album that Jefferson Airplane has that features the iconic female superstar Grace Slick. She comes into the band and, ironically enough, brings this song with her. This was a song that she had written prior to joining the band, and so not only are they upgrading and getting a great singer, she brings a couple of fantastic songs with her. This song, White Rabbit, and also Someone to Love, were both songs that she had written and brings with her into the band. Again, I think this song has aged very well. It is used all the time in movies and television, recently used by Bray Wyatt in his WWE comeback to present kind of that creepy moment of what's about to happen. Love this song, way ahead of its time, but it gets a nominee in 1967, White Rabbit, Jefferson Airplane. Our fourth nominee is a little bit different than the first 3 in that the first 3 were all songs produced by bands. Our fourth nominee is an album, the debut album from the Jimi Hendrix Experience. Are you experienced? This is, when we talked at the beginning of this program, we talked about proto-metal. Jimi Hendrix is as close to metal as you can get. This is the start of so many things that would influence heavy metal in the 70s. This is the first true guitar god that just takes over with amazing skill. When you look at what Jimi Hendrix was doing and how much of an influence he has on the hard rock and heavy metal scene, the big stars of the day, David Bowie, the Beatles, the Stones, whenever Hendrix was in town, they were there to see him because what he was doing was blowing everyone's mind. It was so out of the ordinary. It was so ahead of its time. Hard to kind of imagine now just what people in that year and that era were thinking when they heard Hendrix. This is a great album. This is, again, the debut album of Jimi Hendrix, and it is maybe one of the best albums that came out in the entire decade of the 60s. Our fourth nominee, Are You Experienced? Jimi Hendrix. Now, going back to our Doors selection, I mentioned the fact that the Doors had two fantastic albums. Well, so did Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix, much like the Doors, has his debut album and then follows it up with a great sophomore attempt. This one, coming in as our fifth nominee, is our second album nominated. It is again Jimi Hendrix with Axis, Bold as Love. I would say that this is one of the more underrated Jimi Hendrix albums of the three that he was going to produce. But it has one of the most covered songs in all of rock with Little Wing. It has one of my favorite songs, Castles Made of Sand. I love Castles Made of Sand so much that I almost nominated just the song to give it a better chance of winning. It is a great song. And again, it really is taking what Hendrix does and softening it up a bit. Tremendous. And of course, one of his greatest guitar solos of all time is on the cover or on the title track, Bold as Love. Really good stuff. Again, maybe not as many hits as Are You Experienced, but maybe a more solid front to back album than Are You Experienced. So, those are the nominees. And the winner is Are You Experienced? Jimi Hendrix. All five nominees, very worthy. But there's no upset here. Are You Experienced is maybe the best album in the entire decade of the 60s. Rolling Stones put out a list, and off this album, 4 of the top 500 songs of all time all came off this album. Now, I know the Rolling Stone has kind of a sketchy history when it comes to heavy metal, but they are pretty much the aficionados of music that came out in the 60s. The 4 songs that made their list, the fantastic Hey Joe, Foxy Lady, The Wind Cries Mary, and Purple Haze. All 4 are great songs. If you spend any time on classic rock radio, you're going to hear these songs. If you have listened to, commercials over the past 50 years, many of these are used for, selling cars or whatever the case may be. And a lot of times you'll find these songs have made their way into different television shows and movies because of their iconic status. There's also a 5th song off this album that is a personal favorite of mine. The title track, Are You Experienced?, features some of the greatest guitar work that had ever been seen at that time. So while the other nominees were good, while Jimi Hendrix's second album is solid, you cannot touch Are You Experienced?, our 1967 winner of the best hard rock and heavy metal performance. But how does it do in the overall Grammys? Let's check it out. Right, 1967. The album of the year was The Beatles, Sgt. Pepper Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, if we're going to fix music and we're going to hold the Grammys accountable, we've got to have a real moment right here. We got to keep it 100. And let's be honest, the Beatles are a bit overrated. I know I'm not trying to say the Beatles are bad. I'm not trying to say the Beatles aren't a great, tremendous rock band from the past. What I am saying is that I've seen lists of like the top 10 albums of all time. Rolling Stone produced one not too long ago where like 6 of the top 10 albums were all the Beatles. That's ridiculous. Listen, this is an anti-drug channel. When my children come to me and say, Dad, all my friends are trying drugs. Why can't I take drugs? I use the scared straight approach. I sit them down and I put on the Yellow Submarine. I make them watch the entire thing. And later, when they come to me glassy-eyed saying, why did you make us watch this? I'm going to say, because people on drugs thought that was great music. And they look at me and they say, Dad, we'll never do drugs because we never want to like music like that. And I'm like, it's okay. It'll be all right. Go up, get ready for dinner. We'll put on some Slipknot. It's going to be fine. Because that's, I think, the key, maybe, to why the Beatles are so wildly popular. It's because everybody was on drugs. The Beatles are okay. But let me tell you something. You put any Beatles album against this monster by Jimi Hendrix, there's really no comparison. Like I say, there's legendary stories of Jimi Hendrix coming to town and people from the Beatles sneaking out to see him perform because they knew that Jimi Hendrix was the best thing going in the 60s. So while the Beatles, and listen, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, listen, this is one of the greatest albums of all time. Don't get me wrong. It just wasn't the best album in 1967 because that belonged to Jimi Hendrix. Are You Experienced? So not only should Are You Experienced win the Grammy for Best Hard Rock Heavy Metal Performance, it should also win Album of the Year. There's also a Grammy every year awarded to the best debuting band or artist. That year, the artist was Bobby Gentry. I'm sure Bobby Gentry is a wonderful person and her family loves her to death. However, Bobby Gentry is not in the same category as 2 major rock bands that debut in 1967. We talked about them, Jimi Hendrix and The Doors. Neither one of those bands even got a nomination, let alone the winner. Now again, I believe the newcomer of the year, the best debut, should go to Jimi Hendrix because again, he put out one of the greatest albums of all time. But both Jimi Hendrix and The Doors should have got nominations. Bobby Gentry, sorry, your music just didn't hold up. Now, when we get into Song of the Year, it gets a little more controversial. The winner that year was Glenn Campbell with By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Now listen, Glenn Campbell, in my opinion, should never win anything. I don't even think he was a good country western artist, let alone someone who would get Song of the Year. My little sister, when I was growing up, got a hold of one of his hits, Rhinestone Cowboy, and played it to death. I've never wanted to break an album over my knee more than that particular record. Terrible. I still have PTSD over it. So we're going to get Glenn Campbell out of there. Now this is where it gets a little, you take your pick. We just talked about The Doors had 2 fantastic albums. Jefferson Airplane with White Rabbit and Someone to Love. And Jimi Hendrix, by Rolling Stone's own admission, had 4 of the top 500 songs of all time that year. There's at least 8 songs I just mentioned better than Glenn Campbell. But the award, I think, goes to White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane. Hendrix wins the title for album and has strong contenders for Song of the Year. But man, you can't underestimate the timeless classic that is White Rabbit. So I'm going to nominate that song for the best Song of the Year. And speaking of which, on the best vocals, especially with the female variety, Grace Slick has to be on there. And instead of White Rabbit, I'm going to give her other song she brought to the band, Somebody to Love, as the Song of the Year for vocals. I love Grace Slick's vocals. And, whether it was Jefferson Airplane or Jefferson Starship, she is just one of the great female rock singers of all time and really deserves much more credit than she gets. And finally, Best Instrumental, you know where that's going. We're going back to Jimi Hendrix. And one of my favorite songs of all time. I love the guitar work in the title track, Are You Experienced? So ahead of its time, so revolutionary. Hendrix wins instrumental, Grace Slick with vocals, song Jefferson Airplane, album Jimi Hendrix. We're taking home the whole kit and caboodle. Best debut has to be Jimi Hendrix. So again, when you look at what the Grammys actually awarded to what was really great in 1967, they missed the mark in every single category. Wrapping up 1967, Jimi Hendrix should have walked away with Best Hard Rock Heavy Metal Performance, Best Album, and Best Instrumental Performance. Jefferson Airplane walks away with Best Vocal Performance and Song of the Year. And let's face it, the Doors should have at least received a sprinkling of nominations. Next week, we'll be taking a look at 1968. And we'll see if Jimi Hendrix can defend his title, because he does have a third album that he produces in the year 1968 that's going to be a very strong contender. Until then, again, if you want to keep track of this over the next, because we're going to go for well over 50 years in this, if you want to be alerted to each of these episodes as they come out, hit the subscribe button. If you think Jimi Hendrix should have won the Grammy that year, give it a thumbs up. If you think the Beatles are overrated, give it a thumbs up. If you think I'm missing the mark on the Beatles, put it in the comments below. Let's get some discussion going. I think I did a much better job than the Grammys. What do you think? In the meantime, I'll see you again here next week, next Tuesday, and we'll be looking at the year 1968. Until then, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.